Here we are going to read about the producer and consumer problem. So this is an example of classical problem synchronization in operating system. So producer produces information that is consumed by a consumer process. So there are two processes which is known as the producer and the other one is known as the consumer. So the producer it will produce information, and what will the consumer do? It will consume the information that is produced by the producer. For example, a compiler may produce assembly code which is consumed by an assembler. The assembler in turn may produce object modules which are consumed by the loader. So in the first part of the example, the compiler is the producer and the assembler is the consumer. And in the second part of the example, the assembler is the producer and the loader is the consumer. Alright, so we can also explain this example using several models. So suppose, let's say that we are accessing the internet. So in that, the client is accessing the server. So the server is a producer which is producing web pages or HTML files, and the client is the consumer which is consuming those files produced by the server or the producer. And how is it consuming? It is reading or it is accessing that. So that it is the producer consumer problem. Now what is the actual problem in this producer consumer problem? We need to make the producer and consumer to work concurrently. So the producer will produce and the consumer has to consume, and they have to work concurrently, so that the consumer will only consume what is produced and it will not try to consume what is not produced, and in that way they have to work concurrently. So let's see what is the solution to this producer consumer problem, or how can we make this producer and consumer to work concurrently. So obviously, one solution to the producer consumer problem uses shared memory. So shared memory, which we have discussed before, is one of the solution to this producer consumer problem. And how is that? To allow producer and consumer processes to run concurrently, we must have available a buffer of items that can be filled by the producer and emptied by the consumer. So in order for the consumer and producer to run concurrently, we should have something called the buffer. A buffer of items. A buffer is a place in which the producer can produce the information and it can be filled in that place. So the buffer will be filled by the information produced by the producer, and consumer will consume from the buffer and empty the buffer. So we can think of the buffer like the shared memory, the region of shared memory. So in this region of shared memory or the buffer, the producer will produce and keep the items or the information, and then the consumer will consume from that buffer, and then this buffer will reside in a region of memory that is shared by the producer and the consumer processes. So this is what we have said. This buffer is where the producer will produce and from which the consumer will consume, will reside in a region of memory that is shared by both the producer and consumer processes, so that they can both access that region of memory, and hence they can work together. A producer can produce one item while the consumer is consuming another item. So the producer can produce one item and keep it into the buffer while the consumer is consuming another item from that same buffer, and the producer and consumer must be synchronized so that the consumer does not try to consume an item that has not yet been produced. So the producer and the consumer has to work in synchronization with each other, so that the consumer will not try to consume something which has not yet been produced. It can only consume things that has already been produced by the producer. So if it tries to consume something that has not yet been produced, then there will be an error. So it should only consume things that has already been produced. So in that way they must work in synchronization with each other. So this can happen with the use of this shared memory. And in this region of shared memory, we will have the buffer of items where the producer will produce and which the consumer will consume.